So the book we are talking about is your latest or one of your latest books, which is She Has Her Mother's Laugh. And, it's quite a thorough read is how I explain it to people, just because it is so thick and you do cover quite a bit of ground in the book. But at the beginning of the book, you mention, you're going to a gene therapist and you're talking about genetics, and that is what gets the ball rolling in this book. I'm curious if that's what inspired the book for you and inspired writing that, or if it was something else that kind of inspired the creation of this book entirely.
I think this book was a long time in coming. I think that becoming a father for the first time certainly made heredity hit home in a way that it hadn't before, because there was going to be this person, our first daughter Charlotte, who would inherit things from me and from my wife Grace, and exactly what those things were, I really had no idea, but obviously it became really real. And so as Charlotte grew up, and as we had another child, Veronica, who also grew up, I think they just kept reminding me that heredity was this odd mystery. And I think finally it got catalyzed because of a lot of reporting that I was doing in recent years on all of the incredible research that has been going into heredity recently. For example, just one case being ancient DNA. So we can get DNA out of fossils of our ancestors from 50, 100, 200,000 years ago, and we can actually line them up and compare them to our own DNA and get a sense of what we've inherited from them. So it all sort of reached a critical mass, which led to me writing this book.
Sure. So tell me, obviously, when you're reading the book, you go through your own process of submitting your DNA to companies like 23andMe and going through analyzing your own DNA and talking about the background of that. I'm curious, what were some of the other research processes for this book like? Because obviously, again, you cover quite a bit of ground in the book, and clearly there wasn't just one process you were going through.
So, in a way, I was kind of greedy. I didn't want to just submit my DNA to one of these companies like 23andMe, because they have a way of looking at a few 100,000 sites in your genome, which is really only a little fraction of your genome. And I had the opportunity to get the whole thing. So I got my whole genome sequenced, and then I brought it to scientists and said, okay, I want to learn about how you study heredity in our genomes, and let's use my genome as a tool for that. And so they would poke around in my genome and talk about the interesting things they were finding in terms of Neanderthal genes, or genes for certain kinds of diseases, or certain associated with certain traits. And then that became kind of a launching pad for exploring the history of heredity, and also looking at the ways in which heredity has nothing to do with our genes at all, that there are other forms of heredity to explore. And I learned about that through a lot of time spent with a number of different scientists who are exploring that in humans, in plants, in all sorts of species.
No, that makes sense. And what a cool way to do more of a big picture thing as opposed to just your personal story with your genome.
Yeah, well, it was a really eye-opening experience for me, and it continues to be an unfolding experience, because one of the scientists who kindly took a look at my genome with his students, Mark Gerstein at Yale, he basically has taken my genome and turned it into a project for one of his classes. So every year, his students poke around in my genome and see if they can find something new. And then I try to come to their presentations and see what they've been learning. What's interesting is that scientists are finding new ways of exploring the genome, but it's still a fair mystery of what exactly it all means. What does it mean that you inherit certain kinds of genetic switches that turn genes on and off? How does that affect you as a person? Our biology is a lot more complex than the genome, which itself is incredibly complex.
Absolutely. Have you found anything really surprising that you weren't expecting from just doing projects like this?
There are certainly weird things. For example, scientists have been looking at certain Neanderthal genes, certain genetic variants that we inherited from Neanderthals. And, some people inherit certain variants and some people inherit others. One of the variants I inherited is associated with a risk of nosebleeds, which is completely bizarre because, first of all, I don't get nosebleeds a lot. So that tells you something about, what it means to have a risk for nosebleeds. It's just an overall risk that's calculated from, an entire population. So it may not actually apply to you. Um, and also, what was wrong with Neanderthal noses? Or maybe there was something about Neanderthal noses that was very important to them. Maybe, being in ice age climates. And then when we inherit it, maybe somehow it affects our noses in a way that isn't good. So it doesn't, I kept finding that I wasn't getting super clear answers. I was just being opened up to more mysteries about our heredity.
That's amazing. So, switching gears kind of on you, do you think that people have understood genetics and maybe more about genetic research from reading your book, or not as much?
I hope that people have been able to learn more about genetics through reading my book. I think that with millions of people getting their DNA sequence from places like 23andMe or Ancestry, it's really important that we come to understand heredity better, that we understand what heredity has to do with our genes and what it doesn't have to do with our genes. What can you learn from looking at your particular profile in terms of DNA, and what can't you? Our identity is not equal to our DNA by any means. And even if you inherit genes that are associated with being tall, for example, as I write in the book, you may not end up tall. It really depends on what kind of environment you grow up in, where those genes are playing out. And I would hope that people reading the book can get those kinds of insights, and also learn about how heredity is very much a human story. That people have their lives have been saved by an understanding of heredity. On the flip side, incredible evils have been carried out in the name of heredity, like eugenics and mass extermination. Like some of the worst things that humans have done to each other, they did claiming that it had to do with heredity. So we need to understand this history of heredity as we go forward into the future, where we're going to gain more control over it.
Absolutely. No, that's a very good point. So, my last question for you, and then I will let you go, is if you could, and it's okay if you can't, if you could tell us maybe what you're currently working on, or what sort of projects you're hoping to do in the future.
Well, right now, I, like a lot of science writers, am very, very busy writing about the pandemic, writing about the race for vaccines, writing about what we're learning about the biology of this virus. I have been working on another book, which will be coming out in the spring, called Life's Edge. And that's an exploration of life and what we mean by the very word, and how we define that boundary between what is alive and what isn't.
Wow, that sounds like quite an interesting read. I'm looking forward to that.
It was a lot of fun to work on. I got to meet some really interesting scientists doing some fascinating work. Whether it's scientists who are looking at slime molds and this bizarre sort of intelligence that they have that allows them to solve mazes and mathematical puzzles. When I spent some time in a cave full of bats to kind of understand one of the hallmarks of life being homeostasis. And then also spend time with scientists who are uh, trying to understand how life emerges from non-life, that boundary in terms of the origin of life, trying to replay that by just mixing together some pretty simple chemicals and trying to get lifelike behaviors out of them. So there was a lot to learn there.
I bet. I'm looking forward to reading it when it comes out. So, well, thank you so, so much, Carl, for letting me interview you. I've had a wonderful time, and clearly, you have expanded a lot of knowledge on genetics just through this book, and I'm excited to kind of showcase it for other people